Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Maxine Berg, who is now Professor Emeritus at the University of Warwick, where she has spent her entire academic career to date, and now she's an associate member of the history faculty at Oxford. She is one of the pioneering scholars of global history of trade, commerce, material culture, and knowledge during the early modern period, with particular emphasis on the economic history of the interface of Asia and Europe. She's the author of numerous books that have helped define the history of early modern economy and global history, including The Age of Manufactures, 1700 to 1820, Woman in History, Eileen Power, 1889 to 1940, The Missionary Question and the Making of Political Economy, Markets and Manufacture in Early Industrial Europe, Luxury and Pleasure in 18th Century Britain, and Writing the History of the Global Challenges for the 21st Century, and that is not a complete list. Professor Berg is the founding director of Warwick's Global History and Culture Center. Former Guggenheim Fellow, Professor Berg was the director of the 18th Century Center until 2007, the director of the Global History and Culture Center 2007 to 2010, an honorary fellow of Balliol College, Oxford from 2009 to date, and fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and a fellow of the British Academy. While all her work has been very influential, I'm quite taken with her more recent work on global microhistory, which I find profoundly sublime. Professor Berg lives in Oxford and continues to research and write in areas related to the early sugar trade, the history of political economy and mercantilism, and early exploration and trade to the Northwest Pacific coast of North America. Please welcome Professor Maxine Berg.
Thank you very much. I'm really grateful to Amitava, Daniel, and Heather for the invitation to this conference, which I've greatly enjoyed. I have learned about all sorts of areas, fields that I knew little about. And I'm really glad to be able to present some work that is drawn from a book that I've recently published. Well, it was a year ago now, written and published with Pat Hudson, called Slavery, Capitalism, and the Industrial Revolution. And if you don't have the book yet, there are a few leaflets about where you can get it for £17.50, which is a bargain for a hardback book. It will go into paperback sometime in the coming year, but I know the price will not be less than that. Now, for this paper, I wanted to explore areas that brought together subject areas that are usually looked at completely separately. And to bring a global history approach to the history of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. And it was my broad statement at the beginning of the paper is that global historians often fall into two camps in their scholarship. They have knowledge of the Eurasian world, or they have knowledge of the Atlantic world, and they rarely put those together. And what I've also found in my reading is that in the research on the history of slavery and early modern capitalism, we see a focus either on sugar capitalism or cotton capitalism. So I tried to write this paper to bring those together. And I also wanted to look at conceptual divisions that are often drawn between commercial, industrial, and financial capitalism. They're often treated as chronological stages of capitalism. And certainly what Pat Hudson and I conveyed in our book was that these operated together right from the very early stages of what we discuss in our book. What I want to do then is to draw out the connected aspects of commercial, industrial, and financial capitalism in two trade-centered parts of British industrialization, sugar and cotton. My paper was quite a long paper, and those who have tried to read it maybe didn't get to the end. But these are the areas that I discussed in the paper. There's quite a lot on the historiography. I have a discussion of the shaping frame of the paper, which I took from the diamond-shaped trade in cotton's global history that was set out by Giorgio Riello. I go on to discussion of the role of colonial groceries and its global history, and especially the sugar trade and consumption, and then on to the discussion of slave economies and capitalism in the political economy of the time. And finally, I look at those connections of sugar and cotton with the manufacturing revolution. Now, I think one of the shaping questions I had was, is there a way of bringing together approaches from global history and the history of capitalism to research how the mercantile trade and production processes of early modern economies actually worked? So I'm trying to seek a much more connective historiography in this and bring together the sugar trade and the cotton trade. So one of those connective histories that I was much struck by is set out in Giorgio Riello's recent paper in Past and Present, where he discusses the diamond-shaped trade, which incorporates the story of South Asia with that of the Atlantic world. So he shifts between the triangular trade, which we have all grown up with, into what he calls this diamond-shaped trade, where that whole history of the Indian Ocean world is incorporated and becomes part of that story that we tell of the Atlantic world. And his approach focused on the consumption of cotton textiles rather than the production-led narratives of raw cotton and cotton textiles. He connected the demand for Indian cotton textiles on the West African coast, the West Indies and colonial North America, as well as Europe, and discusses the cotton system of trade as spanning the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic worlds, creating thus this diamond-shaped trade. Now, as Giorgio Riello sums up, the Indian Ocean and Atlantic worlds are usually treated separately, the one a part of monopoly European East India companies trading in the Indian Ocean, the other a free trade Atlantic world framed by the navigation systems and the slave trade. Now, state monopoly in the form of the Calico Acts enhanced the role of Atlantic markets in Indian trade. It was easier access to trade with the North American colonies and the West Indies than with Britain and Europe that forged a very significant link for merchants between India and the Americas. And that link was established through the re-export trade. So now I want to put up something that I don't think we've seen much in this conference, some data. Now, I hope you can see this, but the story that this tells is the significance of a dramatic rise in British exports to the Atlantic world by the 1770s. Now, this looks even much greater by the late 1790s, but we're already in that period of wartime experiences, the continental blockades, etc. But it's really to emphasize that exports were taking a new, there was a great lift in this, and the Americas and Europe were roughly equal by this period at Europe at 39%, the Americas by 38%, putting together the West Indies and the North American colonies. And re-exports were an important part of this, and a great increase in value terms occurred between the 1750s and early 1770s. Now, if we go on to this, which is also drawn from Riello's work, the re-exported cottons that were sold to North America and West Africa included some printed calicos, but more significantly, they comprised cheaper varieties of loom-woven checks and stripes. So we have to look not just at a trade-in, a consumption of cotton, but just exactly what these were. What was the material culture? We have to look at the objects, and that is what Riello and John Stiles, that I'll come to talk about, this is what they have done. These particular fabrics were popular in African markets. They clothed the sailors and artisans in the Americas, the Creole and free black populations in the West Indies. They were traded as handkerchiefs and neckcloths in the trade with First Nations people. And the enslaved in the Americas were clothed initially in cheaper linens, then the fustians and cotton linen mixes, which comprised during the 18th century the bulk of cotton manufactures produced in Britain. Now, this global framework for Indian and later British textile markets thus brings together that Eurasian side of global history and the Atlantic world side. So I ask everyone to look at the trade figures, to deconstruct these into exports and re-exports, and also to look at the role of the West Indies in this story and not just the North American colonies. I have listened to many talks over the decades about the role of the Atlantic world in British industrialization, and that reference always means only the North American colonies. I recently heard a talk by Bob Allen. It was during COVID, yes, we were all online. He was asked by a student about the role of slavery. He said, slavery was of little significance, but the Atlantic world was. So this, our major economic historians, this is the story they have. But this story of what's happening with cotton, the trade in cottons is only one side of the story. It only takes us so far. We know of those crucial dynamic markets for cotton textiles. We know those crucial dynamic markets were in this wider Atlantic world, which certainly included the West Indies and Latin America. Their markets and the consumer cultures around them, however, relied on another set of commodities based in the New World, on colonial groceries, first tobacco, and then especially sugar. So I take you to a graph you should all know well. Jan de Vries's depiction of the Asian trade over this whole period between 1651 and 1795, and New World trade, where we see the Asian trade rising at about 1.1% per annum, and the New World rising at 2.2%. So it's double. I mean, it's really, oh dear. And I had great trouble when he published this, trying to explain why I was still arguing for the enormous impact of Asian imports on European manufacturers. Well, I had a story to tell, but I've gone back to this, and this tells a really significant story. So I think it took me back to considering the role of those colonial groceries in this whole story. So I think I want to call for integrating these commodities into a global history of capitalism, and it's one that takes our history of capitalism back at least a century before the story that Sven Beckert told in Empire of Cotton, though he certainly does deal in the early parts of the book with this earlier period. But it's a period that is not so much about cotton, but about the role of sugar. And so I want to connect that story with the period of early cotton industrialization. And the other aspect of this is that when we look at this sugar economy, we see the integration of the mercantile and slave and the financial and the slave plantation base that was created in this sugar economy. And it's one from which cotton markets and production could arise. I'm not making any argument for sugar capitalism versus a cotton capitalism, but I think we do need to study them together. And I worked on the Industrial Revolution for years. We never did sugar. And I can't now I just find this inconceivable. And I also now draw your attention to some more data, the distribution of retained imports of England and then Britain between 1700 and 1798. And here we see the Atlantic world predominating in Britain's and Europe's import trade, and that trade is mainly in those imports are colonial groceries, tobacco, coffee, cacao, but especially sugar. And then some key raw materials such as dyestuffs and raw cotton, but a very specific kind of raw cotton that I will come to near the end of my talk, and that is Gossypium barbadense. It was high quality, long staple, and very soft, and imported from the Caribbean and Brazil. It was only much later that the cotton from the southern US states became predominant. It was a different variety. It was Gossypium hirsutum. Now, one of the arguments we make, that Pat Hudson and I make in our book, is that the West Indies stands out as the major single dynamic source of British imports before the 19th century. And if you look at this data, I've put in bold the rise in these imports. It has, look at it beside North America. It's the population, the size of the British West Indies in comparison is much smaller. And there is this very prominent role for the West Indies. The picture is even starker for Scotland, and I take this data from Stephen Mullen's recent book on the Glasgow sugar aristocracy. And here we see this area with a much lower population than the whole of Britain and certainly than in relation to England. We see a much higher relative impact of its international trade. Now, we usually think of Glasgow in relation to the tobacco trade. It lost its monopoly after the American Revolution in this trade, but it recovered to to this trade at very quickly by its merchants refocusing to the West Indies and its sugar, rum, and cotton. So I think that this, this story that's conveyed, it shows, I'm trying to convey this very significant part played by these sugar imports at this stage of the 18th century. It's the early, particularly those middle years of the 18th century between the 1750s and 1770s. So I argue out of this that Britain's early history of slavery and capitalism is a distinctive history. It's based on the rise of consumerism led by colonial groceries and the associated extension of global mass markets for both the groceries and the manufactured goods. Britain's pathway is different than the rest of Europe. The British consumed all their sugar, or consumed it with their their American colonies. The French re-exported most of theirs. So there's a whole comparative European story that I discuss to a small extent in my paper, but I don't have time to follow up with this now. But one of the areas that I'm very keen to pursue in greater depth is just how contemporaries saw this picture in the 18th century. So I do want to write a more extended paper on the political economy of the mercantile system. But for this paper, I just drew comparisons between two characters, Malachy Postlethwaite, much quoted by Eric Williams, and Adam Smith, especially in his book 4 of Colonies in The Wealth of Nations. Now, if we look to Postlethwaite, he promoted state support for the plantation territories. He saw these as part of a commercial union. This was wider Britain. It was part of Britain. And its products were British. And so his fascinating Universal Dictionary of Trade and Commerce, which I have used throughout my research, there's massive amounts in it on all the commodities, the natural products, etc., of the West Indies, North American colonies as well, etc. These territories he saw as a part of, how could we talk about the agricultural revolution? And we've never used this material. We don't talk in our work on the agricultural revolution about plantation innovation. We talk about agricultural improvement. We just usually mean East Anglia, and that's what we discuss. So I ask you to think about the agricultural revolution in a new way by including the plantations, as did Malachy Postlethwaite. Then I turn to look at Smith's vision of the colony trade. Well, he focused on the opening of global commerce on the one hand, but on the constraints of monopoly on the other, because much of what he writes about this is the constraints of the navigation laws. The trade to the Americas was not monopolized in the same way as the East India companies, but it was also a trade that was not free. It was constrained by these navigation laws. All goods had to be shipped in British ships. They had to land at British ports. They vary, the details on the laws varies over a long period, but there's sharp constraints. And Smith argued that these monopoly frameworks in the case of the Americas and the West Indies had distorted the direction and types of trade. Trade moved, he argued, away from the many diverse markets in European regions that were close by. And it had moved to a small number of very large colonial markets at great distance. I wish the Brexiteers had read this. Adam Smith thought that the mercantile system with this distorted the distribution of capital. Capital was invested in manufacture for long-distance trade and in trade in high-value colonial cash crops. And with this, he wrote, it went with slavery. Slavery was an indulgence of the pride of man and his desire to domineer over others. He compared the plantations to precious vineyards, with the prices of sugar so high that planters regarded the rum and molasses that was produced as enough to cover their costs, and with the sugar as pure profit. These high returns encouraged absentee British owners to invest in wastelands at great distance, managed at great risk by factors and agents. This was not the natural progress of opulence, which the model of economic development, which he set out in Book 3. That model of economic development was about small-scale proprietors in the Northern American colonies. And though he thought trade had made enormous contribution, this Atlantic trade had made enormous contributions to Britain, his eye here was not on the plantations, but the future development of agriculture and individual proprietorship in the northern colonies. Okay, so there were, it was just a contrast in the perceptions we see on the role of plantation, agriculture, and slavery in economic development as perceived at the time. But what impact did this Atlantic trade have on changing technologies and manufacture in Britain itself, the guts of the Industrial Revolution? How did the sugar economy connect with the cotton economy in stimulating British and European industry? Well, what I looked at in this particular paper, we explored this much more broadly in the book, but I was particularly interested in the plantations and sugar refineries. Again, all those years I did the Industrial Revolution and I never looked at sugar refineries. Like the plantation mills and unlike the textile factories, these refineries spread all over Britain, spread all over parts of Europe, required high levels of fixed capital of several £1,000s. You could have a cotton mill for several £100s, but several £1,000s needed for a sugar refinery. And they also relied on highly skilled labor to produce the many types and grades of sugar then expected. In the 1670s, I think it was 17, 18 different varieties of sugar could be had in London, 10 in parts of Westmoreland. I grew up with three types of sugar: brown sugar, white sugar, and icing sugar. That was it. Okay, well, there was a major impact also on British industries such as copper and iron. They were needed in these sugar refineries, and the sugar milling equipment as well on these plantations. These plantations were industrial enterprises, not just agriculture. Now I have to press on. I went on to look at cotton mechanization, and I take you back to that Gossypium barbadense. Here I draw on work that Pat Hudson and I did both together, following up on Giorgio Riello and John Stiles's work on the microscope. They used the high spectrum microscope analyzing the particular cotton that went into the fustians and other early cotton manufactures produced in Britain. And we certainly they were very interested in the markets that stimulated this mechanization of cotton spinning. And what we also see is that it was this West Indian cotton, the Gossypium barbadense, that fed the first cotton spinning machinery. And these were the machines that produced the yarn for the checks, the stripes, and the fustians that were demanded in these Atlantic markets. Now, machinery innovates, it develops, so we get the role of this cotton in both in the spinning jenny, Arkwright's water frame, and Crompton's mule. These machines did not just succeed each other, they continued to work together, used for producing different outputs. They're also developed and improved. And with this improvement, they became more adaptable to use other types of cotton, another long staple cotton that comes in from the southern US, and especially after the development of the cotton gin, can be effectively used. So we get that whole story of southern US plantations and the cotton industry. But those crucial first spinning machines relied on West Indian and Brazilian cotton. Well, I'm just going to conclude now. Giorgio Riello set out a global framework for Indian and later British textile markets that brought together a Eurasian side of global history with an Atlantic world side in this diamond-shaped trade. Here, I'll just, got a few points up here. And that early modern capitalism was built in a global framework of production and circulation together. So I think I just want to emphasize that we need to work on merchants and production because merchants produce, as Sven has emphasized. And integrated with this global story of textiles was a story of colonial groceries. So we need to look at, I'm afraid I was rather closed-minded before. I loved the manufactured goods, but I never realized that sugar was a manufactured good until I really got into this. So my paper has sought to bring sugar and cotton together to connect their consumer cultures and technologies and to integrate the West Indian and early North American plantations with British and European industrial and technological change. And again, I emphasize, sugar was not the precursor. It was not part of an early modern mercantile stage of capitalism, predating a more not modern stage of cotton capitalism. Merchants and manufacturers developed markets and production processes for both colonial groceries and cotton textiles. And if you look at the dates of that data that I put to you of the export and import trades, you will see that these were proceeding together, and a global history of sugar and cotton together, these shaped Europe's industrialization. Okay, I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions for Professor Berg, starting with John McNeill.
Thank you, Maxine. I misspent part of my youth compiling trade data from official documents with respect to 18th century Cuba. And one of the things that I thought I learned was that the transatlantic trade was almost fully captured in the official documents, but the more local inter-island Caribbean trade was maybe a quarter, at most a third, captured in the official documents, and most of it was off the books. I wonder about the island of Britain. In your data, you present some oceanic trade, but also trade with Ireland and Europe. How confident are you, how confident are other experts in 18th century British trade in the accuracy of the data you use?
Absolutely little confidence in this, but and the point you make about all the inter-island, I think that just underlines it. It was probably, that role of that trade in the West Indies was likely much, much more significant than we see in this data. And Nuala Zahidia has certainly done extensive work on this area. And there are big underestimates. But if we look at the historiography of the Industrial Revolution, the 18th century economy in recent decades, trade has just really been bypassed. It's been a story of Britain's sui generis. It's just did it itself. It's about demography, it's about agricultural improvement, it's about the brilliance of the great men of the North and their knowledge and skills. It is an internal history and we kind of went that way after Hobsbawm. And I think we need to break out of that, and have been. Global history has posed a challenge, and at least even Bob Allen is recognizing the role of the Atlantic world, but not slavery. So I think that, yes, this data is, there's lots of problems with the data, but economic historians work with data. So I have to do a little. And I think we've got some intervention here from Sven behind you. So I'll just stop there.
Sven.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I'm just puzzled. Bob Allen, I mean, the Atlantic trade mattered, but slavery didn't. I mean, what was produced in the Atlantic?
Well,
how can you make sense of that? And then I wanted to ask you about Sidney Mintz, how you think about Sidney Mintz.
Yes. There was no opportunity to follow this up with him specifically at the time, but I think he was talking about this sort of myth of the northern colonies, their wheat production, Adam Smith's small proprietors in the north. And the West Indies just hasn't featured much in the story of the Atlantic. The Atlantic world historiography has been a North Atlantic world historiography separated off from those who study the Caribbean and Latin America. Sidney Mintz. Oh, I think this is a really great book. Maybe it was so great, and he was an anthropologist, not a historian. Maybe it was so great that it has prevented anybody else coming along and doing more great work on sugar. Well, I think it's time. There is a very good there is very good work that I've seen that's been done on the development of the beet sugar industry, which was a European success story, especially Central Europe. And Britain does not take off on this. They develop the beet fields, etc., but they are followers. The real industrialization of the sugar industry in the 19th century becomes a Central European story. But there is still not very much published. I need to know more about the sugar refiners. I'm getting a bit obsessed about sugar refiners, but there's very little out there that I can find in the secondary literature. And sorry, I'll just add on that. The consumption story on sugar is also absolutely fascinating, looking at how the Southern Italians consumed sugar in comparison to the British, just what kind, what people were consuming. And it's that, and we see also that great re-export trade from the French and the Dutch, especially also the Dutch are really important in this. They had, I think there were 145 sugar refineries in the Dutch Republic in the early 18th century. So, and they are re-exporting a great deal of that around Northern Europe, the German states. So the rest of Europe was embedded in sugar, but it's that through that connection with the Dutch and the French.
Sugar milling and sugar refining are different technologies. So, and don't ask me for the distinctions clearly anyway, but are you distinguishing them?
Well, they are, both of them required a great deal of import of copper, iron, and engineering parts, which are brought from Britain to the Caribbean. The sugar milling was the initial that's the initial stages of breaking up the cane. There's all the just getting it into a state where it could move on for the refineries. And those are great boiling enterprises. And I would compare the skill of, in the boiling house, the skill of a worker in the boiling house to that of an iron puddler. The iron puddler had to know, it was a neck, one of Joe Mokir's uncodified types of knowledge. It was just tacit knowledge of knowing exactly the point to stop the heat and that, where the iron was at the point of being puddled. And similarly with the sugar refiners. It was practice, it was tacit knowledge. These were highly skilled people. And many of them were Black. They were enslaved, but their skills were not acknowledged.
Awet, please.
Thank you, Maxine. A quick question, in case I missed it. You said at the introduction of your paper that you'd be bringing the Indian Ocean world and Atlantic world as a sort of a critique to those who only focus on the Atlantic world, speaking global history from the Atlantic world, and those from the Indian. but both the cotton and sugar as goods, as you presented them, were Atlantic world phenomenon. Did I miss the Indian Ocean component, or how
Okay.
do they feature with the Indian
Well,
Ocean? Please, thank you.
It's the story. It is the trade in Indian cotton textiles, which were crucial for the West African markets, especially in the early. Not just, well, it continued right through in the slave trade to the West African coast, because it was the crucial trade commodity. Those calicos, the geometrically patterned cloths, as well as the more floral printed calicos, they were really significant in the sumptuary codes of various groups on the West African coast. They were only acquired through a re-export trade, that the cottons were first brought to London. They're bought up by East India in the East India Company trade. They are then picked up in the bundle of goods taken by slave traders to the West African coast. So there has been really good, significant work done on that textile trade in recent years, that textile trade of Indian fabrics to West Africa, but they're taken via Britain or by the Dutch, initially by the Portuguese. Portuguese traded them first. So that's where that comes in. And the East India Company, it starts first in bringing these pintados from the east coast of India through the trade from Madras, and moves on to the west coast, where we have that trade in the checks and stripes and the indigo dyed cloths, etc. The quality that was demanded on the West African coast was far higher than the British could produce until the 19th century.
Thank you so much. I think you've probably got your hands full with sugar and cotton already. But is there a special relationship between them that explains why you focus on them in particular? The puddling example made me think, why not go more global and talk about the Baltic and Northern Europe and iron production? And do you see sugar and cotton as more central than iron, or what's the relationship? And then a very little nitpicky question. I have a question about the Scotland exports imports graph. England isn't on the graph, and they seem to have no imports or exports from Asia. So I'm just wondering about that chart. I don't know.
Okay. Well, it's Stephen Mullen's work, and so I'm afraid I'm just going to bypass that. I could talk. I don't want to. We can get into some more detailed conversation later. But yeah, the question you ask about the iron and the Baltic, etc. There has been really great work done on this by my colleague in Sweden, Göran Rydén, and Chris Evans in Wales, and they have written some really great articles on this. There's Chris Evans' book, Slave Whales, which discusses both the copper and the iron. And they've done a lot on the connections between the Atlantic, the West Indies and the Baltic. So they've done all that wonderful work, and we drew on it in the chapter that, I led in writing the chapter on the metals manufacture. And so there's quite a lot of it in the book, but they are the masters of that particular subject. I do know quite a lot about iron. I've learned a lot about copper from reading their work and also quite a lot from Nuala Zahidia, who has recently been doing quite a lot on copper. But I had never realized, this was an industry that was really created on this new trade. It was in the doldrums. It was a tiny industry in the doldrums before this trade opened. And it has major technological revolutions over this period. The Welsh method and all sorts, and huge if we're talking about factory complexes, we need to go to South Wales and the Paris Mountain copper mining area, but also the refineries just over the Dees, near St. Helens, the refineries there, the refineries in Southwest Wales. They were vast industrial complexes long before cotton. And with, all that wage labor, we're talking about labor extraction of huge amassing of laborers in one concentrated place.
I'll go back to the question Awit asked, but from the point of view of sugar. Maxine, you have already talked about the cotton in the Western Indian Ocean. At the risk of upsetting Sven, and I lived in Mauritius for 3 years and did a number of archaeological excavations and made a list of sugar mills in Mauritius in the 1780s was about 280, and it was an incomplete list. And as you know, sugar, once you cut the sugar cane, you have to extract the juice and process it immediately. Add to that Réunion, add to that Saint-Domingue, add to that Trinidad, Barbados, Brazil. The systems, the sequence, the architecture of industrial production seems to me was achieved in these sugar islands before we can speak of a cotton industry in the United Kingdom. How do you respond to that?
Oh, I think that this is, I just think we need to do lots more on sugar refining. I really, what you say, and again, it depends on the kind of sugar that was being brought out. The British mostly exported from their possessions in the West Indies. They mostly exported Muscovado sugar and refined it in their refineries in Britain. And they consumed a great deal more of this kind of sugar and in the form of rum. And so we need to look at distilleries. Gin goes into making of gin. And it was even used in whiskey. But if we look to the French colonies, they are largely exporting clade sugar. It's white sugar. It's more highly refined. They allowed that refining in Saint-Domingue and their other colonies. And they re-export then, they refine it further in their refineries in France and re-export it out to other parts of Europe in many different forms. But we know so little about all these sugar refineries all over the territories, not just in Mauritius as well, and Réunion, etc., as well as the West Indies, but also sugar refineries in so many of the major and minor European and British cities. Angerstein. I'm a great reader of Angerstein. I really like that. He was this Swedish industrial spy, went round Britain in the mid-18th century and writes about all these sugar mills he finds all over Britain. So there's probably, I mean, the numbers you quote for Mauritius are amazingly high. I think there were about 150 that he counted around Britain, but there were more than 50 in London, a lot in Bristol, more others in Liverpool, but all kinds of small towns also had these sugar refineries. So it was one of the key, a pretty central industry. High amounts of the coal consumption in London were taken up with, fed into the sugar refineries. The sugar refiners were the major projectors and investors in the first fire insurance companies, because of course they were catching on fire a lot.
Thank you very much. I'm not seeing any other questions, so we'll close this panel. Emily, do you?
On the refining of sugar, how does it add so much value over the Muscovado sugar? Is it because the Muscovado was still a little damp and might spoil? So the refined sugar is lasts a lot longer. I don't understand why everyone was so keen on refining Muscovado, which looks like white sugar, doesn't it?
No, the clade sugar, they went through, and that's why they called it the clade sugar. There was this whole further, well, there's several stages that it went through. So there's several further stages of production, and it does come, they do produce a much more highly refined product than the basic brown sugar, which is what the Muscovado basically was. And as I said, at the time, there were far more sugar varieties than we even think of now that were available across the country. So there were, and it's also there. It involves an export of. I mean, you could write about the earthenware industry and the sugar refining, because these great pots, casks were sent out for that process of claying the sugar.
Okay. Yeah, I thought that in the milling process you could extract the molasses and have white sugar that's not a refined sugar, but looks white. So
yes, but it's not. It is pretty basic, and it's just whether the British, I don't know if it was in their navigation laws or whatever, but they did not allow those further stages, whereas the French did.
Thank you very much. Thanks for a very illuminating paper, Professor Berg. We'll close this session now. And we are back at 4 o'clock for the last paper of this conference.
Thank you.